Good morning. I'm going to call to order this regularly scheduled meeting for the Elections and Rules Committee for Tuesday, March 25th. My name is Jacob Fry, and I'm here with my colleagues, council members Palmisano, Warsami, Quincy, Andrew Johnson, Blong Yang, Bender, and Gordon. So let the record reflect that we have a quorum, barely. Colleagues, we have 3 items on our agenda this morning. Items 2 and 3 have staff reports associated with them, which will require a bit of focused time. The first item has to do with the appointment of elections judges for the upcoming District 3 vacancy for Hennepin County Commissioner. Under Chapter 2, Section 6 of the City Charter, the council must appoint election judges. So this is a fairly routine matter, so I don't anticipate any questions, but staff are present here if anybody has any questions. All right, seeing that there are no questions, I will move that the staff recommendation, which is to formally appoint the slate of election judges as presented to serve the 2013 special election and to authorize the Director of Elections to designate additional election judges if needed to ensure adequate staffing. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The ayes have it, and the list of election judges has been approved. They are hereby appointed election judges for the 2013 special county election. The election director is further authorized to provide additional election judges if needed for, this applies both to the primary as well as the general. So the second item on the agenda is a report of the 2013 municipal election. A copy of that report, which is quite lengthy, has been provided to everybody in their email boxes. And here with us we have the clerk, Mr. Casey Carl, who's going to give us the rundown. Mr. Carl?
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Casey Carl. I have the privilege of serving Minneapolis as city clerk, and as such, I am the city's chief elections official, which means that I am responsible for elections and related voter services for the citizens of Minneapolis. Before the committee, as the chair mentioned, is a report my office produced which analyzes the 2013 municipal election, along with a list of recommendations related to future improvements. The report includes 2 exhibits, which are reports from consultants who were retained by the city to provide an overall assessment of our performance in administering the municipal election, as well as general election operations, and also to survey voters, non-voters, election judges, and candidates in order to provide a deeper understanding of election results that were achieved last year. On November 5th last year, more than 80,000 Minneapolis voters participated in the regular municipal election. The city served 75,145 voters at its 117 precincts on Election Day, with just under 6,000 voters, which is about 8%, opting to take advantage of same-day registration in order to participate. In the end, the city achieved a 38% voter turnout in the 2013 municipal election. And while that doesn't set a new record in terms of participation, it was 43% higher than the most recent municipal election in 2009, which marked the debut of ranked choice voting in Minneapolis. The city did set a new record in terms of in-person absentee voting for a municipal election last year, serving 2,835 voters here at City Hall in the weeks leading up to Election Day. In fact, on the very first day of absentee balloting last year, the city served more than 146 in-person voters. By comparison, on the first day of in-person absentee balloting in the year prior, the 2012 presidential election, we served only 15 voters. The heavy in-person turnout prompted the elections team to quickly develop plans to transform the rotunda space in City Hall into a polling place in order to serve the heavy flow of in-person absentee voters throughout the 46-day period for absentee voting. In total, 4,954 voters chose to cast absentee ballots last year, which included 528 voters who were served by our healthcare facility team. Given that the state has enacted no excuse absentee balloting, which becomes effective with this year's gubernatorial election, the city will need to take additional steps to assure that the detailed processes associated with this particular method of voting is carefully orchestrated and sufficiently resourced. This slide depicts voter turnout for municipal elections over the past 20 years, from 1993 to 2013. The blue line on this chart represents the total number of pre-registered voters as of 7 a.m. on Election Day each year, just before polls opened. The number establishes a baseline of potential voters who are eligible to participate in the election, not including those voters who may have participated through same-day registration. The red line shows actual voter turnout in each of those elections. The middle space, that gap between the blue and the red line, represents what I refer to as the potential voter gap. This is the aggregate number of potential voters based on the total registered voters on election day each year who choose not to participate. It might also be called the city's opportunity gap. As this chart shows, during that 20-year snapshot, the opportunity gap increased by about 13 points, from 53% in 1993 to 66% in 2013. Fortunately, last year's election changed the overall downward trend. As you can see, the blue and red lines have been moving in opposite directions. In 2001, there was a 59% potential voter gap, where 127,875 eligible registered voters simply chose not to participate. That gap increased 4 years later, in 2005, to a loss of 69% of the eligible potential voters. And again, in the next election, it significantly jumped in 2009 to 80% of eligible registered voters who chose not to participate. In last year's election, we had an increase in the number of eligible registered voters who did choose to participate, and the city recovered about 14 points in that opportunity gap. As you know, the city conducted a comprehensive evaluation of voters and non-voters following last year's election, and some of the findings may help us identify barriers and other issues that need to be addressed in the future in order to lessen this opportunity gap. That survey, which was conducted by the Morris Leatherman Company, is appended to the staff report as Exhibit A. And I'll be addressing that survey in a moment, so I'd like to put a pin in this issue of opportunity gap with voters and come back to it in a little while. This slide shows a heat map coded by neighborhoods, identifying those areas where voter turnout was from highest to lowest. The darker shades represent areas where there was a higher concentration of turnout. Lighter shades indicate lower turnout. The neighborhoods with the highest percentage of voter turnout included, and this is in alphabetical order, Bryn Mawr, Cooper, Fulton, Kenny, Kenwood, Linden Hills, Lyndhurst, and Seward. I know that this slide is difficult to see, so we have provided printed color copies at the dais for you. I also have a copy on the overhead here so that we might get some help from the technicians in back to display this for our audience who are viewing from home. In addition, there are extra copies printed available with the clerk. The 2013 election was the city's second experience with ranked choice voting, also called RCV, and I'm pleased to report that it was a successful experiment that was enhanced through a series of process improvements, an aggressive voter outreach program, and partnerships throughout the community. As this committee is aware, the city enacted 3 amendments prior to last year's election aimed at improving the administration of an RCV election, based on our experiences in 2009 when we implemented ranked choice voting, as well as observations from the implementation of ranked voting in St. Paul in 2011. Those improvements included the use of election night first choice results to declare unofficial winners, requiring write-in candidates to file no less than 7 days before the election in order to be individually tabulated, and improved policy guidelines to address voter intent consistent with state election law. Because of these rather simple changes, the city was able to declare winners in 14 of the 22 races on the ballot on election night. That represents roughly 64% of the entire ballot. Only 8 races could not be declared on election night based only on first choice results, and therefore required additional tabulation. Results in the 14 races that were finished on election night were announced and were simultaneously published to the city's elections website, posted in the city's information center, which is located in the Rotunda, all within 2 hours after polls closed at 8 p.m. The elections team announced final results in all 22 races within 72 hours after polls closed on Election Day in 2013. 4 years ago, in 2009, the city required 15 days to tabulate results before winners could be announced. And again, we were successful at completing tabulation in all of these races in a significantly more condensed time frame, while serving a 43% increase in turnout in last year's election. One of the factors which contributed to our success last year was the new voting system and equipment purchased by Hennepin County. This new system features an exportable cast vote record data file formatted in Microsoft Excel. And these exportable data files were the key to getting full vote results quickly and eliminated the need for a full hand count as was required in 2009. This slide summarizes the various steps that were involved in the tabulation processes, both in 2009 and in 2013. In 2009, you can see the city developed the Minneapolis method for hand counting an RCV election. That method consisted of 5 distinct phases: the transmission of results data, a complete sort and hand count of all ballots reflecting preferences across all 3 rankings in each race, data entry of all possible candidate combinations into an Excel spreadsheet, tabulation of the results based on the hand count and data entry, and finally a determination of final results and the declaration of unofficial winners. Those 3 middle steps, the hand count, data entry, and tabulation, were the most time-intensive and costly to the city. Using the exportable CVR data file in 2013, the city was able to eliminate the hand count and data entry steps. This essentially means that what the city was able to do was transmit results data immediately to move to tabulation. It represented a significant savings in both time and costs in the 2013 election. The full data files for each race on the 2013 ballot were posted to the city's election website, and they remain available there for public access. That's at vote.minneapolismn.gov. Despite these significant technical improvements, it's important to note that there remain no federal or state standards for the certification of voting systems, which means that there is no fully automated system which tabulates RCV ballots available on the marketplace which could be used in Minnesota. In Minnesota, voting systems must be certified both at federal and state levels. And while the new system that was purchased by Hennepin County last year is fully certified for use in regular elections using traditional plurality or first-past-the-post methods, there are no certification standards for alternative voting methodologies like RCV. In large part, this reflects partisan gridlock at the federal level. The United States Elections Assistance Commission has not updated its certification standards since 2005, which was the last time that there was a fully functioning EAC. Those commission positions are appointed by the President with confirmation by the U.S. Senate. Because it has proved impossible to appoint new commissioners, the EAC has not updated its standards. The last standards, as I mentioned, were approved in 2005, which was fully 4 years before Minneapolis became the first jurisdiction in Minnesota to implement ranked choice voting. The practical consequence of this political impasse is that new standards must be adopted before vendors are able to develop improved systems and software that might be capable of fully automating tabulation processes for alternative voting methodologies like RCV. Therefore, at the local level, we must be sure that any process we do use mirrors a hand count for tabulation for any race where first choice election night results cannot be used to determine a winner. As previously reported, because of the lack of standards at federal and state levels related to this new export data file, the city retained the services of Freeman Craft McGregor Group, a Florida-based corporation with expertise in testing and evaluating voting systems. FCMG conducted a full assessment of the new voting system and its exportable data file in conjunction with an audit of the city's tabulation procedures. Staff was already reported in October last year that FCMG found that the new voting system produced consistent, accurate data files and verified that the city's tabulation procedures generated accurate results that could be replicated consistently and which provided a sufficient audit trail for post-election reviews. So this slide shows the tabulation process in brief. After polls closed at 8 p.m. on election night, results data were wirelessly transmitted from all 117 precincts to the Hennepin County Elections Office. The precincts here are shown in green. At the same time, the city's elections team submitted all absentee ballot data to the county, where it was merged with precinct results into a single data file of all election results. This merged data was then transmitted by the county to the Secretary of State, where a report of the results was published for public access. The county's elections office retained the original full results data file and provided a copy to the city's elections team for tabulation. Having the county retain the original data file provided an important check in the process, since any tabulation completed by the city could be audited against the original files that were retained by the county. The city immediately set about the task of determining if any unofficial winners could be declared on election night. Happily, as I mentioned, in 14 of the 22 races, the city was able to do that, and we announced winners on election night within 2 hours after polls had closed. These results were announced publicly, posted on the city's elections website, and also printed copies were posted in the City Hall Rotunda, with results in all 14 of those races reported through various media outlets on election night. In 8 races, the city was unable to declare a winner based on first choice results, and therefore additional rounds of tabulation were required. That process began the next day at 11 a.m. on Wednesday, November 6th, beginning with the mayoral race. The mayoral race required a total of 24 hours to complete 34 rounds of tabulation before an unofficial winner could be declared. At the halfway mark, having completed 14 rounds of tabulation in 12 hours on Wednesday, the tabulation team had eliminated write-in candidates and 13 of the 35 candidates on the ballot. Another 12 hours was needed to complete the full count before an unofficial winner could be announced at approximately 11:30 p.m. on Thursday, November 7th. The remaining 7 races that required additional rounds of tabulation were completed in 10 hours on Friday, November 8th, basically requiring about 1.5 hours per race to complete tabulation and declare results. In 2013, a post-election review was conducted of randomly selected precincts to verify that the new voting system had accurately counted votes. This was the first time that a post-election review of an RCV had been completed by the city, since a full hand count was conducted in 2009 and therefore negated the need for a post-election review. The post-election review involved a hand count of 2 precincts for separate ward single-seat races and also for the Board of Estimate and Taxation as a multi-seat race. No discrepancies were discovered as a result of the post-election review between the exportable data files and the actual ballots in any of the 4 precincts that were selected randomly to be included in the review. On page 7 of the staff report is a section titled Voting Patterns. This section explores data with respect to voter errors and choice drop-off. Looking at the data, it's clear that voters who chose to participate understood ranked choice voting, although many did not take advantage of the option of ranking more than a single candidate, particularly in less competitive races. As this committee is aware, the issue of voter errors has generated much attention, both prior to and in the wake of the 2013 municipal election. And as I have stated many times before this committee and with the news media, voter errors can and do occur in any type of election, regardless of what voting methodology is used. Voters make errors in plurality elections, like the traditional first-past-the-post method, and voters make errors in other systems, like ranked choice voting. In short, there is no single voting methodology that is perfect for all voters in all situations all of the time. For that very reason, Minnesota election law requires election administrators to make every effort to accurately count all votes on a ballot when possible, and prohibits the rejection of a ballot when it's possible to determine a voter's intent. Because state election law doesn't address ranked choice voting, however, the city is required to provide additional policy guidance for the treatment of voter errors that are unique to ranked choice voting. There are essentially 3 types of RCV errors that voters can make. These include overvoting, which occurs when a voter chooses more than one candidate at a single level of ranking; skipped ranking, which occurs when a voter skips a ranking level but does rank a candidate at a lower ranking level; and repeat ranking, which occurs when a voter chooses the same candidate at 2 or more different rankings in the same race. Again, the data suggests that by and large the majority of voters understood how to properly mark an RCV ballot. The incidence of RCV-specific errors was very low across all races. The incidence of overvoting and skipped rankings occurred in less than 1% of all races where voters chose to participate and rank at least one candidate. As I mentioned, overvoting and skipped rankings both occurred on less than half of 1% of the ballots across the 5 races on ballots in each of the precincts. Overvoting was slightly higher in multi-seat races than it was in single-seat races. And this might be explained by the fact that multi-seat races are more complicated than single-seat races, in which voters must express preference for more than a single candidate amongst the slate of candidates for multiple seats in a specific race. In addition, the city's educational efforts focused almost exclusively on how to mark an RCV ballot in single-seat races. So there may have been less familiarity with the process of expressing preferences in a multi-seat race last year. The majority of ballots with skipped rankings showed that voters skipped the first choice but went on to rank a second choice or even a second and third choice. Again, the total number of ballots with skipped rankings was less than 1%, and of those ballots with this specific type of error, more than half were errors where a voter skipped a first choice rank but did continue on to rank at lower levels. It is possible, of course, that voters may have believed that they were strategically voting to support a preferred candidate by skipping their first choice option, or they may have been attempting to express that none of the candidates in a race were their first choice among the candidates. The city lacks sufficient data to explain the basis for skipped rankings, although either of those scenarios are certainly possible. The most common type of voter error in 2013 was repeat rankings, sometimes called bullet voting. Repeat rankings occurred on just over 3% of all races voted, and interestingly enough, it occurred more frequently in races that had 2 or less candidates. The higher incidence of repeat rankings perhaps reflects the mistaken belief that choosing a preferred candidate at multiple ranks could advance that candidate when additional rounds of tabulation were required. Again, the city lacks further data to determine if repeat rankings occurred at a higher rate than overvoting or skipped rankings, specifically because voters intentionally chose to repeat a candidate, or if voters misunderstood that repeat rankings diluted the strength of their ballot. Either way, the higher rate of repeat rankings emphasizes the need for more voter education. This table before you summarizes the RCV-specific errors I just described that were discovered in the 2013 municipal election. As you can see, the highest incidence of any of the 3 types of RCV-specific errors was, as I mentioned, repeat rankings in races that had 2 or less candidates. Of the 22 races on the ballot, 9 had 2 or fewer candidates. These included 3 ward races and 6 park district races. What is encouraging is that the rate of voter error across the entire election is quite low, less than 1% in most cases. I'd like to believe that the city's aggressive outreach and education program played a significant role in this outcome. The city's survey of voters did find that 92% of respondents indicated that they were aware of the fact that last year's election would require them to rank their preferences before casting their ballots, and 81% of the survey respondents rated their personal level of how to mark and cast an RCV ballot correctly as perfectly well or fairly well. Combined, the low rate of voter errors and the self-selected level of awareness and familiarity on how to mark and cast RCV ballots reported by survey respondents are reassuring that our engagement and education efforts were successful last year. Another issue that generated significant attention prior to Election Day last year was the number of rankings that would be made available to voters. Because of limitations with the new voting system and tabulating equipment, the decision was made to retain the limit of 3 rankings per race, which is the minimum number that is required under the city's ordinance. Additionally, because of limitations with the automark, the city opted to retain a portrait orientation for the ballot. Of course, the city did not receive the new equipment until quite late in the year, and we had to program the tabulators and train staff and election judges on the use of those machines. These decisions on ballot design and layout impacted how the ballot was presented to voters, and it may have affected participation, although we lack sufficient data to draw firm conclusions in that regard. What the data do show is that voters chose to use all 3 ranking opportunities in only 6 of the 22 races. And that's less than 1/3 of the total number of races on the ballot. Races where voters used all 3 ranking opportunities included the mayoral race, which had 35 candidates, Council Ward 5 with 4 candidates, Council Ward 9 with 6 candidates, Council Ward 12 with 5, Council Ward 13, which had 5 candidates, and the Park Board at-large race, which had 10 candidates. In the remaining 16 ballot races, the majority of voters chose not to use all 3 rankings available to them. This chart provides a summary of the number of choices used by voters in the various races on the 2013 municipal ballot. The data seem to suggest 2 general conclusions. First, as previously stated, it appears that voters understand how to use ranked choice voting process, and voters are more likely to take advantage of ranking opportunities in races with a large number of candidates. This is most obvious in the mayoral race, where the difference between the combined number of voters making first and second choice rankings more than doubled when those opting to make a third choice in the race are included. The difference in the mayoral race was a factor of more than 50 points. However, in the Board of Estimate and Taxation race and the Park Board at-large race, fewer voters opted to use all 3 rankings available to them, and the spread between voters expressing only 1 choice and those expressing 3 choices was much closer. Also, the data seem to indicate that the specific ballot position of a race on the ballot does not appear to negatively impact voters' decisions to take advantage of ranking opportunities. For example, the number of voters choosing all three rankings for the Park Board at-large race, which was the fourth race on the printed ballot and appeared on the reverse side from the mayoral race, actually received higher numbers of rankings in all three of the ranking opportunities than all but one of the council or ward races, which were all listed on the front side of the ballot. Second, the data suggests that providing three rankings may be sufficient for the majority of voters to express their preferences. In 16 of the 22 races on the ballot, a majority of voters chose to rank fewer than three candidates, opting not to take advantage of opportunities to rank additional candidates in those races. In the 6 remaining ballot races, a substantial number of voters chose to rank fewer than three candidates. In the mayoral race, for example, the data showed that about 8 out of 9 voters did not find value in using more than 2, despite having 35 candidates in that race. Staff is proposing the formation of a work group of key stakeholders to evaluate and make recommendations on improved ballot design options prior to the next regularly scheduled municipal election in 2017, which we would bring forward to this committee for its consideration. Of course, a successful election day could not be possible without the corps of dedicated election judges who serve on the front lines of democracy. Over the past few years, we've refined our staffing model to assure a sufficient number of judges are available at each precinct. As this slide shows, state law currently mandates a minimum of 4 judges per polling place. Building on that basic requirement, the industry standard is 1 judge per 150 voters, although this can be heavily influenced by other factors, such as the type of election that's being programmed, the projected voter turnout and historical trends in similar types of elections, as well as ballot content. In fact, research has shown that the single greatest factor that drives voter engagement and turnout is ballot content. In other words, what offices are up for election, who the candidates are, how competitive the races may be, as well as ballot questions that might be submitted to voters. In Minneapolis, based on our lessons learned, we've increased our basic staffing model by focusing on the required number of team judges and not including the leadership positions of head and assistant head judges in the mix. We started that change last year with the 2013 municipal election, and it was a very successful improvement which allowed these leadership positions to monitor, manage, and mentor team judges rather than filling in for the team judges with specific tasks. By segregating the 2 leadership positions in each precinct, we've been able to ensure that these positions are not tied up with tasks and duties, but can therefore oversee the entire operation of their assigned polling place, which also assures better service to voters. But that means we have to undertake greater recruitment efforts without dedicated resources. It was extremely taxing on our small team in the elections division last year, which resulted in last-minute changes in recruitment efforts even on election day. As this committee is aware, we based our staffing projections for last year's municipal election on a potential turnout of 60% based on registered voters that were available, the numbers available to us in February. We justified the use of that higher turnout number for several reasons. First, it was the first open seat in the mayoral race in 2 decades, and we were concerned about the potential impact that might have. At that time, of course, we also had no way of knowing that we would have a record-setting 35 candidates on the ballot in that single race. Second, there were 2 proposed charter amendments on the ballot, both related to the plain language charter revision, which ultimately was adopted by voters. Third, last year's election was only the second experience the city had with ranked choice voting, and at the time that we made our initial projections, we were not confident that we would have new voting systems and equipment, and we were trying to be conservative in our estimate in the event that we would have to staff for a full hand count of all ballots. Finally, in the aftermath of the historic turnout in 2012's presidential election, staff believed it was prudent to raise the bar to assure sufficient staffing in all 117 precincts on election day. This table summarizes the staffing levels that were projected based on that number of pre-registered voters as of February 4th, 2013. As you can see, the number of election judges required averages to about 12 across all 117 precincts, including the 2 leadership positions. This was a significant increase in staffing compared to municipal elections in prior years. The investment paid off in that voter wait times and delays were almost non-existent on election day. Universally, my office received reports indicating that all polling places were operating smoothly and without major incident. We had more than sufficient staffing in place to meet turnout, and as a result, we were able to use the added election judges to provide some last-minute instructions to voters in the polling place about how to properly mark and cast a ranked choice voting ballot. We called this the three-touch rule. Essentially, the three-touch rule required election judges to connect with every voter at least 3 times before the voter cast his or her ballot in order to verify that they knew how to properly mark and cast an RCV ballot. By deploying additional judges to all precincts, we had extra greeter judges available. Greeter judges were responsible for verifying that voters were in the correct precinct as they entered the polling place or the queuing line, organizing separate queuing lines for pre-registered voters and for same-day registrants in order to expedite wait times and reduce unnecessary delays. Providing same-day registration materials to voters who needed to take advantage of that option while they were waiting, and verifying that they had the required identification with them. Identifying any language support or translation needs that voters might have needed while they were waiting in line. Offering voters explanatory materials about how to mark and cast an RCV ballot, which were available in multiple languages and formats. Assisting voters who might have experienced physical discomfort or who were physically unable to wait in line to vote, which included coordinating curbside voting, and also distributing sample ballots so that voters could familiarize themselves with the ballot while waiting in line to expedite the time spent in the voting booth. By all accounts, we were successful on all fronts. In addition to the basic team of election judges, the city's Elections and Voter Services Division made special efforts to recruit and strategically deploy additional judges focused on providing language support and translation for voters. This slide shows that the city was successful at recruiting and deploying 612 team election judges to provide language and translation support. Of these, the highest number of languages supported were Somali and Spanish. In addition to these regular team judges, Minneapolis was blessed to have a number of student election judges participate in last year's election who were able to assist us in providing language and translation support services. A total of 35 student judges provided translation support in our polling places last year. In many instances, these students were the only resource available to us, and they performed fantastically. All judges providing language and translation support were identified with special name tags that included the judge's name and the second language he or she spoke. In total, then, we had 647 election judges who served voters in the 2013 municipal election and needed additional support for language translation. Thanks to our partners in the city's Neighborhood and Community Relations Department, we were also able to assure that all key signage and other election-related materials and polling places were available in English, Hmong, Somali, and Spanish. And of course, our terrific partners in Minneapolis 311 provided timely support when required for language and translation support when those core secondary languages were not available to us in the polling places or when we needed languages that we didn't have. I've mentioned many times that the city undertook an aggressive voter outreach and education plan last year. The staff report provides extensive details about the various elements of that outreach campaign. It essentially focused on a set of core messages that were aimed at assuring all voters would be what we called election ready. Being election ready meant that all voters would know the basics of the 2013 municipal election, which included the date of the election, the location of the assigned precinct and its polling place, and the times when polls would be open to serve voters. The content of the ballot, including the various municipal races and ballot questions, how to properly mark and cast a ranked choice voting ballot, and why it was important to participate in a municipal election. In the interest of time, Mr. Chair, I'm not going to go into specific details, but will refer the committee and interested members of the public to our report for more information about the various initiatives that were pursued in 2013. I would, however, like to single out Anissa Hollingshed for special recognition, who is with us. Ms. Hollingshed is the management analyst with the clerk's office. She is not a member of the Core Elections and Voter Services Division, but because we lacked sufficient resources, she was assigned the task of developing and implementing an entire voter outreach and education plan last year, in addition to her regular duties, essentially from scratch. The conversation, something went like this. I called her to my office and said, Anissa, do a voter outreach plan. And she did. I think everyone will agree that she did an amazing job, from the design of a new and improved elections website to a grassroots voter ambassador program to coordinating last year's Urban Scholar group project on elections, developing social media tools, coordinating the production of myriad videos, handouts, brochures, and other printed collateral materials, to the creation and distribution of our very popular voter guide to all Minneapolis households. Anissa's hand was involved in all aspects. It was a monumental task, and I'm very pleased to say that she exceeded my expectations. Thank you, Anissa. Anissa also was responsible for securing the Morris Leatherman Company to conduct a post-election survey for the city. This survey mirrored the one that was commissioned by the city in 2009 after the implementation of ranked choice voting. The survey included 800 residents who voted in last year's election, as well as 500 voters who did not participate in last year's election, and also election judges and candidates. The Morris Leatherman Company is a full-service market research firm based in Minneapolis. They replicated the original 2009 survey to the greatest degree possible in order to provide a consistent baseline for evaluating results. A full copy of the survey is appended to the staff report as Exhibit A and is available online. That exhibit includes cross-tabulations of the survey data against demographic data collected, as well as an analysis of the results. The city also contracted with Connie Schmidt to conduct an assessment of the election division's performance in administering the 2013 municipal election, and her report is appended to the report as Exhibit B. I'll start with the Schmidt assessment. Overall, Ms. Schmidt found that the city's operations in administering the 2013 municipal election complied with election laws, city policies, and industry best practices. She praised the city's voter outreach and education program and other efforts to engage the community, including our innovative voter ambassador and adopt a polling place programs, as well as the expansion of our existing student election judge program. Schmidt was heavily involved throughout the year in planning efforts, and her recommendations and insights were instrumental in process improvements, including the evaluation of tabulation processes using the new voting system and equipment, changes in defining and consistently applying voter intent policy guidelines, election judge training, workflow redesign efforts and related procedural documentation, as well as improved plans for polling place management, absentee balloting processes, and post-election auditing and reporting. Among her findings, Schmidt noted the lack of dedicated staffing compared to other first-class cities in Minnesota, as well as other major metro core cities in the nation. In addition, she noted the dispersion of election functions across multiple locations, which was a challenge for the city. Finally, she made recommendations related to financing elections, which, not surprisingly, is consistent with data provided by staff in previous reports to this body. Ms. Schmidt notes many of the improvements and changes that are occurring in the industry following the recent publication of the Presidential Election Commission. And in that commission's report, it was emphasized that Americans want and deserve modern, efficient, and responsive elections. Achieving that goal requires the investment of sufficient resources, which the city currently lacks. Those, however, are matters best addressed by the Ways and Means Committee, so I won't address them here. Earlier, I indicated I wanted to put a pin in the discussion about potential barriers and issues that are identified in our survey commissioned by the city, conducted by the Morris Leatherman Company. Again, that survey involved 800 voters randomly selected who did participate and 500 residents randomly selected who did not participate in last year's election. Phone interviews were conducted between November 18 and December 6 last year, just after final results were canvassed and certified as official. Overall, based on answers provided by survey respondents, we know that voters who chose to participate in last year's municipal election, by and large, tended to be Caucasian, middle age and older, more educated, generally with at least a bachelor's degree and some with graduate degrees, with higher annual incomes, upwards of $50,000. Conversely, eligible voters who chose not to participate in last year's elections, but who did participate in the survey, tended to be African American, older, meaning 64 and up, less educated, generally with a high school diploma or less, and with lower annual incomes, generally less than $25,000. These broad brush strokes paint a picture that requires the Elections and Voter Services Division to examine its outreach efforts to better connect with and target populations who chose not to participate. Of the voters who did participate in last year's elections and who also took part in the survey, 92% reported casting their ballots at an assigned precinct on Election Day. This underscores the importance of having a sufficient number of precincts and polling places available with adequate resources, including staff, to meet this preferred mode of voting, which was expressed by the vast majority of voters. Of the 8% who reported voting absentee, the majority of respondents self-identified as Hispanic or Latino and voters with an annual income over $75,000. 92% of responding voters indicated that they were aware that last year's municipal election would use ranked choice voting prior to casting their ballots, and 81% claimed that they were perfectly well or fairly well informed about how to properly mark and cast a ranked choice voting ballot before they did so. 82% of responding voters indicated that they selected at least some rankings beyond one choice on the ballot, indicating that they expressed more than a single choice in at least one race on the ballot. Among those voters making at least some rankings, 87% reported that ranking was simple and easy to do. Despite the relatively high self-reporting among voters who were aware and who understood how to properly cast a ranked choice voting ballot, of those voters who participated in the survey, a slim majority, about 41%, indicated that they preferred the traditional first-past-the-post method. 39% reported a preference for ranked choice voting. Nevertheless, among all voters who participated in the survey, 77% indicated that they were very confident or confident that the election results were accurately counted using RCV. 95% of voters participating in the survey classified themselves as regular voters, meaning that they are active participants in elections, including past municipal elections. 82% of respondents stated that they had ranked more than one choice, which represents about 4 out of 5 voters who participated last year. And of that amount, as I said, 87% indicated that ranking on the ballot was simple and easy to do. And although some concerns were expressed, including opposition to ranked choice voting, a majority of all responding voters, 53%, think that ranked choice voting should be used in future municipal elections. Of those survey respondents who did not participate in last year's election, the majority cited lack of time as the reason for not engaging. A full 33% of potentially eligible voters simply didn't have time to participate. Still more concerning, in my opinion, is the combined total of 40% of respondents who self-reported they didn't participate in last year's elections, either because they don't like RCV or they don't like participating in municipal elections. To me, this is a dangerously high percentage of potentially eligible voters who choose not to engage primarily because they don't like voting in municipal elections. This highlights a particular need for voter education among these non-participating groups about the importance of local elections, the value of city government in terms of the quality of life enjoyed in this community, and the significant implications local government has on the daily lives of our residents. 12% of non-voters claimed a dislike for ranked choice voting as a reason for not voting last year, and among those, most respondents were over the age of 64, had an annual income of more than $75,000, and lived in the southeast area of Minneapolis. Among those who self-reported that they prefer not to participate in municipal elections, most respondents were African American, between 35 and 44 years of age. They were less educated, generally with a high school diploma or less, and had an income of $25,000 a year or less, and generally lived in the east central area of Minneapolis. Although 63% of non-voting survey respondents indicated that they were aware that last year's election used RCV, that awareness decreased among African Americans, Latinos, those with less formal education, again, generally a high school diploma or less, those with annual incomes of $25,000 or less, and residents in the northeast and east central areas of Minneapolis. This feedback gives the city important data to work with in terms of tailoring future outreach campaigns to underrepresented target populations. A mailed survey was sent to candidates, and 37 were completed and returned, which resulted in a response rate of 34.9%. Of those candidates who participated in the survey, there was an almost even split about the perceived impact of ranked choice voting on campaigns. 30% of responding candidates saw ranked choice voting as negatively impacting their campaign, but 32% claimed it had a positive impact. Another 32% of responding candidates indicated that RCV had little or no impact on their campaign. Still, 65% of all responding candidates reported that their campaign strategy changed because of ranked choice voting. Among responding candidates, 73% reported that they were confident that all ballots were accurately counted. Overall, however, the majority of self-responding candidates, by almost 2-to-1, indicated a preference for a traditional first-past-the-post voting method. Mr. Chair, with that very high-level, fast overview, I'd like to point out to the committee on page 33 of the staff report an outline of some recommendations we are making for future improvements. There are primarily 3 recommendations we'd like to present today, and those all pertain to municipal elections and would hopefully be implemented before the next regularly scheduled election in 2017. First, staff recommends that the city's ranked choice voting ordinance be amended to clarify the definition of tabulation center. By law, whenever ballots are physically being counted, in other words, being physically touched, such as in a hand count or a recount process, that must be open and observable by the public. In 2009, when the city first implemented ranked choice voting, there was no automated solution available. Therefore, a complete hand count of all ballots was required. Accordingly, the ordinance was drafted to require that the tabulation center be open and observable by the public. Last year, however, the city was successful in acquiring a new voting system that helped to partially automate the process of tabulating ballots. That process is more akin to the administrative processes that are used to tabulate and report results in traditional elections than they are in a full hand count process. In fact, not a single ballot was physically touched last year during the tabulation process. The use of the exportable cast vote record data file eliminated the need to hand count physical ballots. Therefore, it's staff's position that the ordinance should be amended to specify that the tabulation center would be open for public observation only when paper ballots are actually being handled by tabulators. The tabulation process is an extraordinarily detailed procedure that must be precisely followed to ensure accurate results are obtained. Toward that objective, it is imperative that staff have a secure, quiet workspace, free from distraction, in order to complete their work in an accurate and timely way. As noted, the procedures implemented in 2013 are very similar to the administrative procedures, how we process data in other elections that don't use ranked choice voting. In those cases, a substantial amount of data entry is required despite the use of automated ballot counters, and that work is conducted in a secured, non-public environment, which is allowed by state law. Staff contends that the RCV tabulation process implemented in 2013 should be treated in the same manner as other elections allowed by state law, and that public viewing should be restricted to full hand counts or recounts, times when ballots are actually being touched. Second, staff recommends that the RCV ordinance be amended to change the process for determining mathematical elimination in rounds of tabulation. The current ordinance language specifies a tabulation process based on the manual counting of ballots, as done in 2009. Because we had no prior experience with the capabilities of the new voting system prior to last year's election, we were unable to predict how much faster rounds could be completed using the new export data file. The existing language requires that each round focus on eliminating the candidate with the lowest total number of votes, where an aggregate of transfers could not sustain that candidate's continuing on in the race. It requires tabulators to limit their view of ballot data to a very narrowly prescribed set of vote data and not the entire range of vote data across all rankings in a given race. Simply put, our experience with the new voting system in 2013 proved that a substantial amount of ballot data is immediately available, and it can be factored into the process of mathematically determining the elimination of candidates. It would allow for multiple candidates to be eliminated in one round, what we might call batch elimination, where multiple candidates are eliminated in one round with more than one candidate, when more than one candidate has no chance of accruing a sufficient number of votes to continue. An example is included in the staff report that demonstrates how the use of the full range of data can streamline this process in determining results. Staff estimates that if this process had been in place last year, 32 of the 35 mayoral candidates, which accounts for about 91% of that race, could have been defeated in a single round, the first round of tabulation. Moreover, staff believes that complete results could have been achieved and an unofficial winner declared in the mayoral race early in the afternoon the next day after election, Wednesday, November 6th. Instead, as was heavily reported in the news media, the mayoral race required a total of 24 hours spread over 2 days to complete, and final results were not announced until 11:30 p.m. on Thursday, November 7. Quite simply, the existing language in the ordinance hamstrings us, and it prevents staff from expediting the tabulation process based on complete sets of known ballot data. While this proposed amendment is mathematically sound, it requires an amendment in order to allow staff to implement that change. Therefore, staff strongly recommends that Council direct the drafting of an amendment to allow for faster tabulation in future elections when using the new voting technology. Finally, staff supports efforts to increase municipal filing fees, which is a proposal currently being considered jointly by the City Council and the Minneapolis Charter Commission. A number of further process improvements are listed on page 36 of the staff report, but those are administrative and do not require the policy direction of City Council. They're included here merely as an indication of efforts that staff will pursue before the next municipal election in 2017. Before I stand for questions, Mr. Chair, and with the committee's indulgence, I'd like to recognize the amazing team who pulled off last year's election and who prepared this comprehensive report on our accomplishments, challenges, and opportunities. Assistant City Clerk Grace Walk-LaRoach is the Director of Elections and Voter Services. She's with us. Her vision and leadership were instrumental to all of the successes I highlighted this morning and many more that were not included in my presentation but are outlined in our report. Given the time, we only scratched the surface on the various initiatives and improvements that were achieved last year. I'm very fortunate and extremely proud to have Grace as my right arm and my trusted advisor. She represents this division, our department, and the city of Minneapolis very well. And rounding out the team are our 3 full-time election specialists on staff, Danny Connor-Smith, Tim Schwartz, raise your hand, Tim, and Jim Howitt. Although she isn't here today, I also want to recognize the contributions of Judy Schwartow, who decided to see what retirement was like and left our troop in January. Judy had a long and distinguished career in elections. She was well known both in this city enterprise and throughout the state for her expertise in all things elections, and we will continue to build on the legacy that she left here. And in that same light, it's bittersweet for me to announce that Jim will soon be leaving us. He has accepted a position with the Hennepin County elections team. Jim was instrumental, I cannot underscore that, instrumental in last year's elections. He was the lead for our tabulation team. He managed our warehouse operations. He oversaw the programming of all of our brand new voting equipment and had a hand in virtually everything that took place in last year's election. We are also fortunate to collaborate with almost all of our sister city departments, the 2013 class of urban scholars, with some amazing seasonal staffers and contract workers who come back year after year, consultants, community-based partners, and of course, our dedicated civic-minded core of election judges who make everything possible. And to all of them, I would like to extend my most sincere thanks and appreciation. With that, Mr. Chair, the staff and I are available for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Carl. I'd also like to note that Council Members Goodman and Johnson have joined us. Mr. Carl and staff and the entire department, I think we're all blown away by the work that you did. You were operating on a limited budget with people breathing down your neck with a new system, and I think you did so with grace. No pun intended there, Grace. With that, if there are any questions, and I see Councilmember Gordon has one. Go for it.
I do. I also have a couple comments. And of course, you've given us in your classic Casey Carl report. I just think people at home might want to see how extensive it is. A lot to work with and a lot to think about and a lot to study. I wanted to note some areas where I saw, and I think the voters of the second ward noticed some big improvements. I want to call out the improvements to the polling place experience. I don't want to go back to previous elections where it wasn't so good necessarily, but comparing that, I think that was a goal. That was something we really focused on, and I think we really were successful in making that experience much better. I also really appreciated the outreach plan and the efforts to do that. I think the voters guide was significant, but so were all the other things that we did. I think all of that partnered with maybe some more competition in the races is what helped boost the voter turnout. I'm hopeful that we can replicate some of those things in the future. I am also very interested in looking at the design of the next ballots. If you get a stakeholders group together, I would appreciate the opportunity to have somebody from the second ward participate in that and be involved. As some people know here already, I'm very interested in increasing the rankings maybe to 6. It'd be comparable to St. Paul. I think that we can manage that with our new equipment. My one question, or I just wanted to make sure that we clarified, goes back to those voting errors or those different ways of voting, and I just want it to be clear for everybody, and maybe you can also help explain for us, Mr. Carl, what happens in the case of those errors. It doesn't mean that a vote isn't counted. It doesn't mean that voters are disenfranchised just because there's an error. In the overvote instance, when it's on your first choice, ballots are rejected and the voter has had an opportunity to vote again. I don't know how many did. And we had some normalization adjustments that we made if there was a skipped ranking. And maybe you can clarify if I'm inaccurate in those, or let us know how the other errors, now I'm forgetting the third classic error, and I shouldn't, but you could clarify for us and how we correct for that as well.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Gordon, former chair of the Elections Committee, you know quite well that the new equipment does alert voters of errors in the instance of a overvote. It does not alert voters in the case of a skipped ranking or a repeat ranking, so we're especially cautious with those two. But in any instance, if a voter makes an error and discovers that or is notified of the error by the equipment, they have the opportunity to spoil that ballot and cast a new one. It does not represent disenfranchisement of the voter because a ballot is spoiled. That simply represents, oops, a mistake was made and I have the right to request a new ballot and cast that ballot in the race. And that's available in any election, not just specific to ranked choice voting. Your comments are on point in terms of our voter outreach efforts and as well as our staffing efforts within the polling place to provide a level of assurance to voters. I'm very confident that based on our survey results of those who did vote, voters understood how to mark their ballot. They did so in the very, very few, less than 1% of chance of opportunities where there were mistakes. Those were able to be corrected by the voter. And there are normalization procedures in place, as you mentioned, under the policy guidelines for voter intent that still allow the city to process a voter's ballot even if one of those errors were to make it through the system and be cast.
And so if it's a skipped ranking, we just then adjust that. So if you skip your first choice, but you vote for a second choice, your second choice, we've decided to the council, would become your first choice. And so that gets normalized. And how's the third? How do we normalize for that?
Through the chair, so in the event of a skipped ranking, as you point out, let's take the analogy or the example of a voter skips the first choice but does indicate a preference in the second and third ranks. The second rank would move up and become the first, the third would move up and become the second. In the third example where you have a repeat ranking or what might be called bullet voting, the normalization procedures under our voter intent policy guidelines provide that we will count one of those choices and not the second one.
And I guess that's a good point to emphasize with the bullet voting, is it really does you absolutely no good to bullet vote or to repeat the same candidate over and over, because it gets counted, and once it's counted and held until that.
And has the potential of diluting the strength of that voter's ballot.
Yeah.
Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Carlin, looking through the report, do we have information, and maybe I'm just not looking in the right place, but in different wards, how many people didn't fully use the ranked choice voting in precincts? Do we have that information someplace?
Through the chair, Council President Johnson, we do have those data files available. They're not in our report, but we can certainly provide those to you if you'd like them.
I appreciate that.
Yes.
I also, as everyone knows, I'm not a fan of ranked choice voting. I don't probably need to say that again, but I think it's unfortunate. I mean, the message is that we are getting more educated, a more educated voter and more wealthy voter, all that sort of thing in our municipal elections. And I think this council would agree, maybe I'm wrong, but that's not the direction that we should be going. And so the other thing I feel badly about, I mean, I think all of this demographic stuff sways what's going to happen in these wards. And I spoke out early in the whole mix about senior citizens. And I will tell you, I spoke to people who did not vote because they just find this process confusing. And I think it's really unfortunate. I'd be interested to see if the voter turnout, say through the last 3 or 4 municipal elections, what the percentage of voter turnout is year to year in some of these wards that have heavy minority population. I'd be interested in that information. Thank you.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Carr, for this excellent presentation. I just wanted to kind of echo what Council President is saying and just emphasize how important the city's resources are in really reaching the voters that aren't coming out. And I think a lot of the campaign practices that people use kind of re-emphasize turning out a population that normally votes, because people go to the voter records and they see who's voted in the past and they call and door knock those folks. And I know a lot of our campaigns try to reach out to more new voters, but I'm really proud that the city is putting resources into that as well. And I think, echoing again what Council President said, I support increasing that as well. And I just also wanted to note that Jean Massey is here from Fair Vote, Minnesota, and I must have seen her at 100 different events this summer, just in my ward alone. And Fair Vote just did an excellent job of doing outreach and was a really strong partner in educating voters this year. So I just want to thank them for all of their work.
Mr. Chair, if you would indulge me in an editorial, yes, Ms. Massey was a strong partner to us throughout last year in voter outreach, education, engagement efforts. Sometimes I felt like we were twins. She was the better looking one. I was a more verbose one. But the other piece I'd like to specifically highlight, I glossed over it when I gave my report, but the statistic that stuck out most for me was amongst non-voters who self-reported that they don't choose to participate in municipal elections ever. That's just not what they're going to do. 28% of people reported, we aren't going to vote in an off-year, odd-year municipal election. And amongst those people who self-reported, if you look at the statistical profile of those people, they are the target populations we just discussed. So I think more than ranked choice voting, it's how do you engage people in an odd year election to come out and participate, which speaks to the need to emphasize what is the value of city government to this community and what do we do? I had the opportunity this last Saturday to participate in a panel presentation on the city's boards and commissions at the Community Connections Conference hosted by our Neighborhood and Community Relations Department. And at that time, there was a lot of concern expressed about how to engage. And it's sort of ironic, one of the conversations that emerged was a lack of general awareness about the value that the city provides day to day. And I mentioned these people that are appointed boards and commissions, but also the services that we provide through the city touch our residents' lives 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, every week throughout the year. You know, from aging to zoning, I like to say A to Z, we're touching these people. So if almost 30% of our non-participating voters are saying they aren't going to participate in a municipal election year, that to me was the biggest point I took away from that survey. That's my editorialization.
Thank you, Mr. Carl. Just to echo what you just said, I think there are two separate issues here. There's how ranked choice voting is functioning, and I think you did an extraordinary job in implementing it. And then there's the second piece, which is outreach, and I think clearly, based on these numbers, we need to do a whole lot of work there. A lot of people are being disenfranchised and or not voting, and I think it's incumbent on, in part at least, those who are running to not always do the politically expeditious thing, which is to target those who are not old, but relatively old, white, and wealthy. And we need to move beyond that to make sure the younger people are voting and to make sure people of color are getting out to the polls as well. So, yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you're saying, including the fact that Jean Massey's better looking. Kidding, of course. Councilmember Warsame.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of comments and a question. First of all, I would like to thank Casey Carl and his team for the hard work they did, especially with absentee voting. What I got from my constituents and people who voted was that, the experience was fairly, good and smooth, and they all got to vote. The question that I have is with the ranked choice voting. Even though we did a lot of work in our campaign to get people out and to motivate people felt, especially with the number of candidates for the mayoral race, that there was a lot of confusion. There were similar names. Even in our ballot, there was a lot of Abdis on there, and people got really confused about that. And they were worried that their vote would not count. Now, if we increase the number of choices from 3 to 6, do you not think that underserved communities, communities of color, immigrant communities, those who don't speak English very well, who already were confused with 3 choices, might be more confused?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Warsame, I think that's an excellent point, and it's one of the reasons that we want to form a work group to take, we have 4 years until the next election, and I think now's the time for us to look at how we can better design and lay out a ballot. There are other communities that have ballots that allow you to put a candidate's name down once and then have the little ovals to choose. For many reasons that I briefly touched on, we made the decision last year to keep the portrait orientation, which required us to list the candidate's name 3 times in 3 separate columns. That created some confusion. So I think the key is not necessarily the question of choices. That's a policy consideration. It's really getting at ballot design and how we format the ballot and how that ballot then is presented to voters so that it's easily understandable, easy to navigate, and easy to understand. And that's what my goal would be for the work group to look at.
Okay, just to follow up, can I get the error rate from this year and the last couple of years in terms of the ranked choice voting? Yeah. I think I need to get that because I think we had less error rates this year in Ward 6 than the previous one.
We can get you the data from 2009, the first year with ranked choice voting, and from last year's second experience with RCV.
All right, thank you.
President Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Another option, Mr. Carl, if people are saying they're not going to vote in municipal elections, I know it was brought up to the Charter Commission to get rid of municipal elections and put them into the general election and run in that cycle. I know people laughed at that and thought it was awful, but it certainly is perhaps a way to get to that group of folks who have decided that municipal elections, aren't where they want to vote. Sometimes you got to go to the people.
Thank you, President Johnson. Seeing no further questions, I will move that we receive and file the clerk's report. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed. The next item on the agenda is a clarification of the definition of the tabulation center. Mr. Carl has already explained quite a bit of it, but I'd like to see if there are any further questions before I make the motions while we got Mr. Carl up here. No. Seeing none, I will move the staff recommendation, which is to direct staff to draft an ordinance amendment to clarify the definition of tabulation center and to bring that draft back to this committee for consideration. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? That one passes. The second proposed amendment has to do with amending the process of mathematically determining which candidates are eliminated in each round of tabulation using the new voting equipment and enhanced system. I have a question on this one, but are there any other questions? I'll defer to you guys first. Mr. Carl, I just want to make sure I understand this correctly. This would dramatically expedite the process by knocking off all the people that are definitely going to lose right off the bat. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, you are correct.
Okay. So that's the purpose. So the motion here, I'll move the staff recommendation, which is to direct staff to draft an ordinance amendment to update the process of mathematically eliminating candidates using new voting systems and technology and to bring that draft back to this committee for consideration. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed? The ayes have it, and the staff is directed to draft and bring back the proposed amendment. The final agenda item is a report about the recent changes in state election law, rules and regulations that will become effective this year, and how those changes will impact Minneapolis voters. Mr. Carl.
Mr. Chair, with apologies, this last item was added too late to provide the written report. You should have at your places on the dais this report, which is titled Summary of Minnesota Rules Changes Effective for the 2014 State Primary. This past week, I, along with some of the members of the Clerk's Office, attended and participated in the annual conference of the Minnesota Clerks and Finance Officers Association. And at that conference, we had the privilege of receiving a presentation by Secretary of State Mark Ritchie on these matters. I wanted to take this opportunity while you're gathered to put in front of you some election-related updates that will impact Minneapolis beginning with this year's gubernatorial election. The report highlights it very quickly. Under Article 1 is the issue of absentee voting. As you know, beginning this year with the 2014 primary in August, Minnesota will officially move to no excuse absentee voting. Essentially, this means that voters who choose to use absentee voting will no longer be required to self-select one of the statutory reasons which was previously required to allow a voter to participate via absentee balloting. In addition, the change authorizes the absentee ballot board to begin processing absentee ballots 7 days before the election. Previously, it was 4 days. We're hopeful that this will lessen the burden of processing thousands of absentee ballots during the chaotic days immediately preceding Election Day. Under Article 2, I just wanted to highlight the first bullet here. As you can see, the rules about voter vouching have been changed. They are already in place and effective. Starting with last year's election, voters may now vouch for up to 8 individuals. Previously, they were allowed to vouch for up to 15, so this is a reduction in the total number of individuals for whom one voter can vouch. The associated regulations require us to update our related forms and documentation associated with voter vouching. Article 4 relates to a proposal to authorize the use of electronic rosters, typically referred to as e-poll books. You may recall that this is an issue which Minneapolis has supported in prior years. It's a much-needed reform that will streamline the process of voter verification in polling places on Election Day. The process of voter verification was identified nationally as one of the leading causes that results in long lines and voter delays. A pilot project was conducted last year in selected precincts. The participating cities included Dilworth, Minnetonka, Moorhead, St. Anthony, and St. Paul. In conjunction with that pilot project, a statewide electronic roster task force was appointed that included a diverse stakeholder representation. I'm pleased to report that our elections director, Grace Wackler-Rowitz, was a member of that task force. The task force presented its report in January this year, and a second project was proposed for this year's gubernatorial election, which would have included precincts located in Minneapolis. I say would have because the legislature recently voted to strip funding from that project proposal, so I am unsure about the future of this second project. We will, of course, keep you updated. Article 5 has been added, which became effective last May. This new provision addresses a vacancy during nomination. Essentially, this addresses the Paul Wellstone scenario. What happens if a candidate dies just before an election, or if a candidate otherwise becomes disqualified or withdraws just prior to an election? There are provisions for partisan offices and separate provisions for nonpartisan offices. The nonpartisan provisions would apply to our municipal elections. In the event of a vacancy being declared during that nomination period immediately prior to the election, as I described, a mandatory 5-day filing period is implemented, including a 2-day post-filing period withdrawal time frame, and the election is then moved from November to February. Obviously, we haven't experienced this process since the law was enacted, but the policy framework now exists in case that situation is in place, and the Secretary's office would provide us with the policy regulations to implement this provision if and when necessary. On page 2 of the handout, I provided a lot more detail that's associated with some recent regulatory changes made by the Secretary related to voter identification. The Secretary has proposed to allow additional forms of identification to be used by voters, either to register to vote or to take advantage of same-day registration in the polling place. This is intended to help offset the impact in the reduction in the number of vouching that one voter can do. Effective with this year's election, voters may take advantage of these additional forms of documentation to register and to vote. As you know, in the past, it was generally required that a photo ID, most frequently a driver's license, and a utility bill was required. The new regulations allow voters to use additional forms of photo ID, which would include an out-of-state, a non-Minnesota driver's license, a learner permit, and secondary student IDs like high school or college, university student ID cards. The definition of bill has been expanded from utility bill to include a broader variety of documentation. This would include, for example, start of service notifications, credit card or banking statements, rent or mortgage statements, and residential lease or lease agreements. So these new regulations will allow a voter to present either a printed copy of these bills or an electronic display using their personal electronic device, such as a smartphone, a laptop, or a tablet. We'll need to train our poll workers about these expanded forms of identification that is allowed. We also will want to reach out to the community so that voters are aware of these new changes that give recognition to a broader variety of voter identification forms. Mr. Chair, I just wanted to cover those points quickly. While the committee was addressed, we certainly can answer any questions. I think it was fairly straightforward. No action is required.
Thank you, Mr. Carl. Councilmember Gordon, I apologize. I may have forgotten you in the previous one, but go for it.
There was just a couple things that I wanted to note, and this relates to item number 2. One was, as the ordinances are drafted, I'm assuming somebody will author those on the council and give notice, and will give subject matter introduction and refer to the committee as usual, because we just directed staff to draft some ordinances. So I'm assuming that'll happen, and just wanted to clarify. Also wanted to just make people aware of discussions that I've had with the Charter Commission and the Charter Commission Chair, Barry Clegg, and I know that I've talked to council members about this, but this relates to the raising of the filing fee. I've had some discussions with them. The Charter Commission will bring a proposal forward. I've been talking about bringing back the original proposal they made in April of last year that had the mayor's filing fee at $250, the council at $100, Board of Estimate at $20, and the Park and Rec Board at $50. Being the one no vote, when we looked at this in December, Barry asked me and Mr. Clay to see if there was something that I would feel comfortable with getting to a 13-0 vote to change the charter. I'm comfortable with this. I'm trying to also find out if my colleagues are, so that we can get this done quickly and easily.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. Councilmember Quincy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wondered, my question isn't about this, what Councilmember Gordon was just saying, but I think Councilmember Goodman has, so if I could defer, that would be terrific.
Councilmember Goodman.
Councilmember Fry, Chair Fry, Councilmember Gordon's proposal, does it include a signature possibility too? I'm sorry, I missed that part.
Yes, it does, actually. The state law mandates that anytime we have a filing fee, we have the signature option, and that would be clarified. Even in the language in the charter that we're looking at, that would be mentioned in there as well.
Okay, Chair Fry, but I want to note that if anyone thinks that the numbers should be higher, like more along the lines with what the Charter Commission suggested, we certainly can let the public decide. And I don't think one person on the council saying they wouldn't provide for a 13-0 vote. I might have a completely different opinion, which might be what the Charter Commission suggested in the first place, or some hybrid of that. And I bet putting anything on the ballot to raise the fees will pass. So it might be that we want to, if there isn't agreement on the amount, then perhaps we would just put it on the ballot in November.
Councilmember Gordon, anything further?
Yes, that's the other alternative. Absolutely.
Thank you. For any further questions that I missed? Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can a charter provision go on the general election ballot? Mr. Carl?
Through the chair, we can certainly put one on the general election, and in fact, the Charter Commission has already procedurally moved forward with notifying or providing notice of a public hearing on this proposal to raise the filing fee, so that it's meeting in April. I'm looking to Peggy, who clerks them. April 2nd, they will conduct a public hearing on a proposal to raise filing fees, so that if the council is unable to secure a 13-0 vote with the mayor's approval, they could move forward to put a question on the ballot. While I have the microphone,
This
Mr. Chair.
November.
This November.
Thank you.
To clarify the provision of signatures, you cannot tie a filing fee and a signature petition together. That's not what's going to be proposed. The law, state law, which would trump our charter, says you have filing fees. We can set those filing fees in our charter. You cannot change the statutory provision that talks about signature petitions. That is a separate issue. It's a state statute. Our charter does not affect that. We fall under it. The state statute says that in place of a fee that we set, you can allow a signature petition, and the state law prescribes what that signature petition must be. That's not up to us.
Thank you, Mr. Carl. I'd just like to note for the record that I believe the majority of the impetus for this change had to do with the slew of mayoral candidates that we had. When you have 35 or 40 candidates, everybody's signing up. If they have $20 in their pocket, this is a way of culling that field a little bit. And I mean, it is my point of view that if you can't either get a bunch of signatures supporting you or raise the $250 or $500 for the filing fee. You get really no chance of winning anyway. So with that, I don't think any motion is required. This was purely informational, and there are no other items on the agenda right now, so this meeting's adjourned.